I want you to take a look at this fork and imagine that it can talk. Now, do you imagine this fork as a man's voice or a woman's voice? Chances are, if English is your primary language, you're probably saying, I don't know, it can be either. But if your primary language is something like French, where la fourchette is a feminine object, you're probably saying it's a woman's voice. But if your language is something like Spanish, where el tendor is a masculine object, you're most likely saying it's a man's voice. This is one of the many examples and experiments conducted that showcase the idea of linguistic relativity, a theory in the field of psycholinguistics that states that language can shape our perception of reality and control our thoughts. And today I wanted to walk you through its history and show some interesting experiments that showcase the plausibility behind the idea of linguistic relativity. Alright, the history. Linguistic relativity is also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. It's a theory that Edward Sapir first came up with in 1929, and then Benjamin Whorf built more upon it with the idea that language determines how the world is perceived. This is now also known as the linguistic determinism and the strong hypothesis, and people originally loved this theory. But later in the 1980s, this theory was questioned by a scientist named Eckhart Malachy with his book Hopi Time. Malachy studied the Hopi people, a Native American tribe in Arizona, and their language which has no grammar or structure pertaining to time. Considering the strong hypothesis, the Hopi people shouldn't have a concept of time, but as we know, that's not physically possible. And with this, more and more people eventually became more disenchanted with this theory. But eventually the idea of neo-Whorfianism rose up, and people came up with the idea of the weak hypothesis, the idea that language merely influences and affects thoughts. In the last 20 to 30 years, there have been many experiments that support this hypothesis, some of which I would like to talk about. The first is a common experiment that has shown the impact of grammatical genders on thought and perception. An example would be the question I asked earlier with the fork, and the impact of grammatical gender of fork in your native language and how it most likely affected your answer. A similar study was conducted with German and Spanish speakers where they were asked to describe a bridge. In Spanish, bridge is el puente, a masculine noun that prompted the speaker to describe a bridge with masculine adjectives such as big, dangerous, strong, and sturdy, as opposed to German speakers, where the Brücke is a feminine noun, and a bridge is described using feminine adjectives such as beautiful, elegant, and slender. Similarly, another experiment found in the Scientific American in the article How Language Shapes Thoughts by Lyra Boroditsky, she conducted an experiment with English, Hebrew, and Kuuk-Thaayore speakers. Kuuk-Thaayore is a language spoken by an Australian Aboriginal tribe and is spoken entirely in terms of absolute cardinal directions, and you have to know what direction you're facing in order to be able to speak properly. In this study, people were given sets of pictures that showed temporal progression like a man aging, food being eaten over time, etc. Interestingly, from the youngest to oldest, English speakers put these images from left to right, while Hebrew speakers put them from right to left. Differences believed to be because of the direction that these languages are written in. But even more interesting is what the Kuuk-Thaayore did. They never consistently did it in one direction, but did it depending on what direction they were facing. For example, when seated facing south, the cards went from left to right, the opposite when facing north, and when facing the east, the cards were vertical and came towards the body. They were never told what direction they were facing in. They just knew and used their spatial awareness to construct their representation of time, some more proof of how language affects perception. The last study I wanted to talk about is in the same article of the Scientific American and was done with three groups: Japanese, Spanish, and English speakers. They were all shown videos of two people doing different actions either intentionally or accidentally, like popping balloons, spilling drinks, and breaking eggs. When it came to actions done intentionally, all three groups described the events in a similar fashion and were able to say who did what, saying things like, he popped a balloon. But when it came to accidents, Spanish and Japanese speakers were less likely to describe the agents agentively and even remembered who did it less well than English speakers. This isn't because of memory differences, but rather the language structure, as when done accidentally. English speaker would still say something like, John broke the vase. But in Spanish, one would say something like, se rompió el florero, or the vase broke. Further proof of the influence of language. At the end of the day, while all these experiments and studies help the theory of linguistic relativity, there are still many different linguistic beliefs from cognition controlling language, also known as universalism, to the other side of the spectrum, language controlling cognition, also known as linguistic determinism. and many different ideas in the middle. Psycholinguistics, just like psychology, is a growing and relatively young field dating back to the late 18th century, and I'm sure that there's bound to be more research and answers to be found in the future.